Good morning. I said to Anne, I ought to be able to do this from memory, but I always type it up just in case. It's my great pleasure to welcome Anne Meredith to Sunday Seminar, this time for a 4-part series on learning about the key histories, text, rituals, and beliefs of 4 major religions outside of Christianity. The Adult Spiritual Formation Committee has been talking about having a series like this literally for years. And finally, we just said, well, why don't we ask an expert? And so here she is. For those of you who may not know Anne, she is the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Religion and Classics at the University of Rochester. Among others, her classes include Ancient Christianity, Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, Introduction to the New Testament, and Religion and Violence. And if you get on the U of R site, you can see her list of courses is about this long. So for those of you who are new to us, welcome. And it's all yours.
Great, thank you. Yes, so Karen told me that folks were wanting a 4-part series on world religions. And I was like, well, I'm not a world religions scholar, but I can dig back into my graduate school. I'm not as on sure footing as I am when I talk about Christianity. I have to admit that when somebody asked me to speak about Christianity, I'm like, well, I could do that in my sleep. So you guys are making me work for a living here by having to go back and remember, okay, like what are the key things about that? So today I'm going to talk about Hinduism. I'm doing them in kind of historical order. So I'm talking about well, in the West, Hinduism and then Buddhism, and then I'll talk about Judaism, which I've talked about a lot in different ways when we've done topics about from the Hebrew Bible and prophecy and religion and economics. We talked a lot about biblical economics and things like that. So I have done some of Judaism, but we'll do Hinduism and then Buddhism, and then we'll do Judaism and then Islam. And that will be our February. So thanks so much for joining us. So the first thing that I want to tell you about Hinduism is that there is no such thing as Hinduism. So it does not exist. There is no such thing as Hinduism. Of all of the world's great religions, Hinduism, more on that topic in a minute, is the oldest. For which we have recorded texts, of the religions that still exist today. Obviously, we know of religions that are defunct now that existed before Hinduism, but of all the main world religions, I'm just going to make sure I follow the order that's on here, so just grab these for myself. Hinduism is the oldest, but as I said, there's no such thing as Hinduism. The term Hindu comes from what Greeks and Persians and Romans referred to the populations of people who lived on the other side of the Indus River back during the Mediterranean period. So Hindu relates to the word for the Indus River. And Hinduism as a term was coined in the early 1800s, in the early 19th century by the Brits as part of their imperialism in India, coining this phrase to refer to all of the customs, what seemed to them to be like the religion of the various groups that were coming under British imperial control during that time period. But if you actually say, well, what is Hinduism? There's no central text. I'm going to be talking about a bunch of texts. There's no central founder like Jesus or something like that. There's no singular set of practices. What we call Hinduism is, in fact, I would say 2 things: a philosophical tradition, which is contained in the sacred texts of Hinduism, and then also just a wide array of collection of stories, myths, rituals, and practices that have taken local shapes within India, which is a massive continent, massive country, South Asian continent, and so their rituals, their practices, celebrations, but there is no one form of Hinduism. So that's one of the things that you need to know. That now what started to happen as a way to resist colonization and cultural imperialism, you did start to have leaders within India start to refer to Hinduism, right? So originally it's a British term, and then Hindus themselves adopt it to kind of draw lines so that they don't become overly assimilated as Christianity and Islam kind of started to make inroads into India. The fact of the matter is that outside of India, there was not that much information or knowledge about Indian philosophy, Indian texts, Indian practices, really until the British regime. You don't have Westerners being particularly interested in India, and you don't have Indian philosophers and teachers and writers and leaders being particularly interested in Western traditions. That really starts to happen in the second half of the 20th century and continuing on to today. So if you take anything away from this, it's that there's no such thing as Hinduism. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk just about some of the key texts. Scriptures in a way is a wrong term, but I'm going to talk about some of the key texts, some of the key ideas start there, which is really the philosophical tradition. But the vast majority of people don't read Sanskrit in which these texts are written, right? The vast majority of people are everyday people. So then I'm also going to talk about, well, what do everyday people who identify as Hindus nowadays, what is the kind of religious activity that they engage in? And these philosophical ideas and concepts underlie all different forms of Hinduism. They're key to all different forms of Hinduism, but the idea that, which is kind of a construct of the West, of India as this place of mystery and exotic teachings. And I'll talk a little bit about the co-optation of yoga by the West, for example. And people, I used to have, not so much anymore, but I used to have students come to me and be like, oh, people in the East are so much more spiritual than we are. And I was like, have you been to India? You know, so, this idea, right, that a religion consists of like, what are the core concepts, right? I mean, Christians are not, if we look around at us as Christians, you can say, well, what are some core Christian ideals? Well, radical self-impoverishment. Most of us are not engaged in that, right? So what are everyday Christians doing? What are everyday Hindus doing? Okay, so I want to talk about some of the foundational texts, and some of these texts are the oldest and the longest sacred texts that we know of. The most important foundational texts are called the Vedas, and I won't get into too much detail, but the Vedas, the most famous one of those is the Rig Veda, and it's their creation narrative, essentially. But what you have in the Vedas are texts that date as early as 1500 BCE. So they predate any of the texts that were in the Bible. So, Hebrew Bible. So there are 4 different Vedas, but they contain philosophical discussions. They contain hymns, they contain rituals, just like the Bible contains narratives, historical stories, legal codes, right? So too do the Vedas have many different genres kind of within them. So they have mythological tales, philosophical reflections, descriptions of rituals, hymns that should be sung, poems, things like that. And the Vedas are considered within Hinduism to be the foundation of all Indian religious practice. They are not considered to be historical texts, right? They're conceptualized as conveying in language, which is inherently limiting, eternal, fundamental, foundational truths about the universe. Now, the second group of texts that are often separated out are actually at the end of the Veda, which is called the Vedanta. The word Veda just means knowledge or insight. So the Vedanta, which means the end of the Vedas, when you get to the end of the Vedas, there's a series of philosophical texts that collectively together are known as the Upanishads. The Upanishads. And if you're interested in reading any part of the Veda, this is what I would recommend. And the Upanishads delve into the main concepts that I'll be talking about later. What is the vital creative energy force that pervades the universe? How is that related to each individual soul? how do we break out of our cycle of death and rebirth? So these are really the mystical texts that contain the key concepts that I'll be talking about in just a minute. And they emphasize essentially the key realization that all Hindus want to come to in their lives is that your individual soul is in fact identical with the sort of cosmic soul of the universe. That is the basic insight of Hinduism. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. The next two major texts are essentially epics, and they're the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And part of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, which is the text that most people who know anything about Hinduism know that text. It's become very popular. I'll talk about that in just a sec. So the Ramayana is a story that if you were to think of an analogy to Western texts, it's that idea of the hero's journey, the quest kind of narrative. And so it narrates the story of Rama, who is a prince. He's also an avatar or an incarnation of a divine figure named Vishnu. More on the gods and goddesses in a minute. And he goes on a journey. He's on a quest ostensibly to rescue his wife. And he goes on a journey in which he encounters various obstacles and moral and ethical dilemmas and things that he has to encounter. And in so doing, he learns about the importance of duty, responsibility, loyalty, courage, moral action, all of these kinds of things, and learns about around these qualities. And he's considered to be the kind of ideal man. Going on this journey, he not only exhibits these great virtues, but he's also cultivating them and learning them about them. So the Ramayana is a kind of hero's quest tale, which conveys or has in it, right, this learning curve by this wonderful, perfect, ideal man, right? But nevertheless, he's there to learn about courage and bravery and morality and duty and things like that. The Ramayana is very popular. Parts of it are performed. One of the things that you'll see is a lot of at Hindu festivals are performances of parts of the myth. And these are called Leela. And the word Leela or Leela plays, a Leela is a play, but it also means playful. And there is a lot of playfulness. The gods are playful in these kinds of narratives. So you might have, for example, the Ramayana is often recited and performed and played out, or parts of it are celebrated during Diwali. So I'll talk more about that festival in a little bit. The second major epic is the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata is the longest scriptural text known to humanity. It's about 100,000 verses. It's extremely long. I have not read the whole thing. It is very, very long. And it is basically a story about war and violence. And it is framed as a story between two houses, right? Two noble houses, right? They're fighting. And the center part of the epic is the buildup of the war. And the most famous part of the text is a part of the Mahabharata, which is called the Bhagavad Gita. So have people heard of the Bhagavad Gita? Right. So that's the one that you would have heard about. The Bhagavad Gita is basically a part of the Mahabharata where the Prince Arjuna has Lord Krishna, who's one of the deities. Lord Krishna has come down and is his charioteer. And they end up having a series of conversations because Arjuna, facing war, it's a difficult thing, all the things that you're going to have to do. And the most famous teaching in the Bhagavad Gita is that it is your responsibility as a human to do your duty as best as you can. And you have to release attachment to the fruits of your labor. You do your work without worrying about what's going to happen. So in the case of Arjuna, he is a warrior, right? So he needs to be the best warrior that he can. That's his role in life. That's his dharma. That's his duty. And so he has to do that to the best that he can. And that throughout the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is also teaching about various different kinds of yoga. The word yoga means yoke, and it's both it's an intellectual, a spiritual, and a physical practice. I'm going to talk about yoga a little bit separately in a few minutes. But there's different ways that you can achieve kind of enlightenment. You can either do that through devotion, through knowledge, or through selfless service, right? There's different ways of cultivating yourself. And so Arjuna is learning about these from Krishna. So the Bhagavad Gita is a wonderful text. It's short, so it's much shorter. And it's really become a classic of global world spirituality, right? Many people have now read it. And also it seems as if it kind of, when you start to have more interactions between the West and the East and interest in Hinduism, and Gandhi was very interested in Hinduism and in the Bhagavad Gita, and interested in non-violence, which is interesting because the Mahabharata is all about violence. But this became a text that was really consumed by Westerners, almost as if they kind of needed a counterpart to us. What are the sacred scriptures of Hindus? Well, they're not going to read the Vedas. Those are very sacred texts that it's considered only certain people should read them. The Upanishads, which are part of the Vedas, these epics are really long. So it became an easily digestible way for people to learn about Hinduism. And it is a beautiful text. So I do suggest reading it. So those are the main texts. You've got the Vedas, within the Vedas, the Upanishads, you've got these big epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, within which you have the Bhagavad Gita. You also have other texts that are produced, of course, just like within Christianity, right? We'll have saints' lives, or we'll have letters. I mean, so there's lots of these kinds of texts, and lots of them they're called Puranas, and they're stories and tales about various ones of the deities and their activities, and they're sort of smaller narratives. So those are the key texts that we have. So one of the things that I talked about was that the Vedas are the oldest texts of Hinduism. And the ideas contained within them, particularly in the Upanishads, underlie all of Hinduism, no matter what area you are in, right? So if maybe you're from Bengal, maybe you're from Tamil regions, maybe, North India, South India, wherever you are, these key ideas that are found in the Vedas and in the Upanishads underlie all of Hinduism, no matter how somebody practices. So they underlie all of sort of Indian spiritual culture. So what are those ideas? Well, the first key idea and the central idea is the notion of the concept of Brahman. And Brahman is ultimate reality, the unchanging creative energy and force that pervades the universe. It both imbued in all of existence, it also transcends all of existence. It's not a person, it's not a being. It's abstract and it's impersonal. So one of the things about Brahman, this energy, this force that pervades the whole universe and gives it meaning and transcendence and existence and all of that, is that it has two aspects to it. And these two aspects are called nirguna, and that means without form. And that's the abstract part, right? You can't, there's no person of Brahman, right? Sometimes people will confuse that with the creator God that I'll talk about in a minute, which is Brahma, but there's no person that is Brahman. It's an abstract energy field, right, that pervades the universe. But then there's also saguna, which means with qualities or with form. All of the deities are saguna, right? They are a form, an aspect, a feature, a personification of some aspect, some feature of Brahman. So different aspects of the divine. So when I get to, so Hindus say there's 33 million gods, right? So those are saguna. Those are the various aspects and features of of the divine, if that's what we want to call Brahman, of the divine. So I'll talk more about those, some of the more famous gods. Obviously, they're not worshiping 33 million of them. That idea is supposed to be, right, that this idea that the Brahman contains multitudes, it's infinite, it's everywhere. So that's the main concept about ultimate reality. The other key aspect is Atman. So an Atman is your soul, your individual human soul. Every living being has Atman, has an individual soul. Your Atman is actually Brahman. And that's what enlightenment is. When you truly realize that Atman is Brahman, Brahman is Atman, right? That you are one with this force in the universe. Now, this may sound very abstract, right? This might sound very abstract, but in fact, it's an idea that we see in Christianity. If you think in John chapter 17, for those of you who have read it just generally or studied it with me, in John chapter 17, that is a prayer of Jesus, Jesus's farewell prayer, where he's praying to God. And he's talking about what is the knowledge, what is the awareness that he has come into the world to tell the truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. He's become a light to come into the darkness. And what that is that he needs to teach people, and he summarizes it and says, essentially, that God is love, and the love that Jesus has, the love that God has for Jesus is the same love that Jesus has for his followers, that they have for each other, and they will realize that they are one, just as God and Jesus are one. And right, they're all, you're in me and I'm, right, this mutual indwelling is the Christian theological language that we put to that John language about the love and the energy and the power that is within you, that you get from Jesus, is the same that he gets from God the Father, right? Which is the same that we share with each other. And that true enlightenment is realizing this, right? Jesus says, not everybody's going to get this, right? Not everybody's going to understand this, Jesus says, but that real enlightenment is realizing that God is within you and God is in fact within everybody. So that is the Atman, and you spend your life trying to come to that realization because we are distracted by many things. We get tied down by many things. Our desire for food, for sleep, our laziness, our desire for sex, for pleasure, for hedonism, our anger, our emotions, the things that block us, the way that we hurt each other, right? The way we get distracted and can't see that the Atman that is within me is Brahman, that's also in you, and in you, and in you, right? We should all be recognizing that. But of course, that takes, right? Treat others as you would have them treat you. Why? Because they too have that world soul within them. So it seems like a very abstract idea when you talk about it, but it's actually quite similar to Christian ideas. So one of the things is that you might know about Hindus is that they believe, or the way that we phrase it is they say they believe in reincarnation. That Atman that lives within you is eternal. It goes on forever. Your physical body does not go on forever. So, and it is changing, right? I'm a baby and now I'm an older woman and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So your body's going to change over time. That soul within you is not going to change over time. And you are trying through each stage of your lives and existence, you are trying to become, to put it bluntly, a better and better person, a more and more enlightened person, closer and closer to the real realization that the divine energy that pervades the world is the same that is within you, that is within everybody. The word for this in Hinduism is samsara. This is the cycle of life, death, right? So you are born into a certain body, your soul is born into a certain body, takes a certain form, right? Saga takes a particular shape, and then you go through the cycle of your life and you die, and then your soul is then reborn, which is part of the Brahman anyways, then reborn into another body. Life is hard though, and what you really want is to break free from that cycle. So how do you break free from that cycle so that you can sort of take your rightful place, which is going to be a place of liberation and bliss and freedom and enlightenment? How do you break free from that cycle? Well, when you break free from that cycle, that's called achieving moksha, right? This is very mystical, right? You might say it's like nirvana, right? We use that term from Buddhism, so we'll talk about that term with Buddhism. But moksha is the ultimate goal of any Hindu, liberation from this endless cycle of coming back into a body, living your life, an endless cycle. And there's various different ways that you can release yourself. And this is related in Hinduism to those kinds of yoga. Yoga is not just, this stuff, right? It's related to yoga, different forms of practices. So yoga is related to the word meaning in a way to yoke yourself. So you want to yoke yourself to knowledge, to devotion to the gods and goddesses, meditation, right? All the ways that you can move yourself towards enlightenment. Now, that's, it's going to take you many life cycles, many cycles of samsara to get through, to ever achieve a position of moksha. And how does it decide, how does your Atman, right, get reincarnated? Well, everything you do, every action, there's no neutral action. Every action is for good or for ill. You do well or you do harm. And that's that notion of karma, right? Which has become, Taylor Swift with her karma and all that stuff, right? She's all, everybody, she's like, karma is real. Well, Hindus would say, yes, karma is real. That basically every action is going to contribute to your growth and your development. So you want to accumulate good karma by increasing your knowledge, increasing your selfless devotion to community, increasing your own spiritual discipline and calmness of mind, right? You want to do bad karma is obviously being mean, being terrible, being, bad habits, but also very, very bad actions. And so you want to collect your good karma so that your next life, you will be in a position to be able to continue your spiritual journey, because it's much easier to continue your spiritual journey in certain positions in life than others. So I try to remind my students of this, that schooling is a privilege, right? It is a benefit. It means that you are not having to work for a living. You are not having to scramble and scrabble, hard scrabble around. You have the time and the luxury to learn and to develop yourself. So the notion of karma and the cycle of samsara in real world terms, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, but I just want to put it in now. In real world terms, of course, is related to the notion of caste. And the idea that there is a fundamental order in the universe, which is dharma, and every person, whatever role you have to live your life according to that dharma, to that there's a fundamental order to the universe. And I'm a professor. I need to be a professor as best I can. I need to fulfill the duties and the responsibilities there. If I'm a farmer, I need to do that to the best of my ability and cultivate the karma that I have there. If I'm a warrior, right? So obviously, in sociocultural terms, this has been used to be a kind of class hierarchy, a sociocultural and economic hierarchy within India. More on that in a minute. But just in terms of the spiritual sense of it, it's that as you accumulate good karma in your next life, you're going to be in a position to elevate yourself even further and elevate yourself even further and elevate yourself even further so that you can eventually break through by obeying your dharma, doing what you're supposed to be doing, following your duties, doing your responsibilities the best that you can with no claim to the fruits of your labor, selfless kind of sacrifice, helping people, cultivating good karma, breaking free eventually from samsara. That's the kind of philosophical goal and theological and spiritual goal behind Hinduism. And so people who are at different castes, right, the untouchables versus the Brahmin caste, that's the highest caste, right? The idea is that they have gone through many, many lives to get to these higher positions, but more on caste, a little bit more towards the end. So these are just these philosophical ideas, but if you look on the handout that I've given you, you'll see, I'm sure you know, whether or not you know anything about Hinduism, you probably have seen these very colorful deities. Hinduism is a very colorful tradition, these various colorful deities. And so if you think about divinity or deity, the goddesses, gods and goddesses are not seen as separate from Brahman, right? They are manifestations of this abstract, impersonal reality because people need to worship deities, right? People aren't all just living at the level of all this kind of intellectual, philosophical reflection. You see the same idea developing in classical Greek thought, where you had people like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and other philosophers who recognized that, or Stoics, for example, they would call Brahman logos. And then Christians take that over and go, oh, you know what the logos is? That's Jesus, right? So Christians took that over from Stoics. But this idea that there's this all pervading spiritual force and energy through the universe. So the Greeks clearly recognized this. And they recognize there's really just a singular spiritual essence and entity to the universe. And for example, one way this manifests itself, this is just a side point, because even if I'm talking about Hinduism, I'm going to throw in my expertise, which is the ancient world. But the Greeks looked at the Jews who were monotheists and thought, oh, this is a race of philosophers, right? Because everybody was monotheistic. From the perspective of Greek philosophers, et cetera, they were like, okay, but the average person needs gods and goddesses, right? That they can focus, that can help mark their life stages, can help them conceptualize and think about and reflect upon different aspects of their life. So you need to have, you know, a goddess like Aphrodite, or, you know, who's about sexuality or sensuality, Bacchus, who's about a little bit more, about playfulness and exuberance and things like that, or, you know, a god of war, so you need to have all these different gods. That's much more what the Hindus are like, right? It's a polytheistic tradition. They claim there's 33 million deities, but that number is clearly to suggest that there's just limitless ways in which the Brahman can be manifested in individual gods. The other thing to realize about the gods in Hinduism is we think of God as having certain qualities: all powerful, all knowing, right? Always doing the right thing. But again, if you think back to the stories of Greek and Roman mythology, if you ever, you know, read those, those gods are doing all kinds of crazy things. They're not all powerful. They're not all knowing. So too with the Hindu gods. They're not all powerful. They're not all knowing. And they represent certain attributes. And we learn from their stories. We learn from their exploits. And so they are manifestations of Brahman, but they're with form, right? They're with form, they're with quality. So they say that there are 33 million gods and goddesses, but I've listed a few. I won't go through all of them, but I've listed some of the top ones, and I've put some pictures of some of the top ones. So the first god is Brahma. Now you might think that sounds like Brahman. Obviously they're related. It has to do with the universe, empowering the universe, but it's just in a way the creator god. The god who's a creator god who's responsible, right? So you've got this impersonal energy and force in the cosmos, and Brahma is the deity who is a manifestation of that, who has this creative energy. So he's created the universe, and he is worshipped as a god of creativity, right? A god of regenerativity, creativity. But interestingly, not that worshipped, not that devoted. There aren't that many temples to Brahma. It's like sort of like, oh, he's there, but you know, it's almost too high in a way for everyday worship. So you don't have a lot of temples there. The gods that are more commonly worshipped and have festivals devoted to them are, for example, Vishnu and Shiva. So you might have heard of Vishnu and Shiva. Vishnu is the preserver, right? He's somebody who protects, he preserves, he creates balance. So he's about creating, balancing and preserving the harmony of the universe. So he's often depicted with blue skin. He's often depicted very regally. You know, this is considered to be a very high god, an important god. The other side of that is Shiva. And Shiva is a god who sometimes can be frightening, right? So on the one hand, Shiva is known as the destroyer. He's a very complex god. He's a destroyer. He's a god of destruction. But in order to clear the way for new growth, so something terrible could happen, but there's going to be new growth that's going to come out of that, rebirth that can come out of that. And that's necessary. You need that. You need to sometimes have everything be destroyed so that you can regenerate or start again. So he is very powerful. He's got very powerful energies, but he's also kind of has a sense of danger. And there's a lot of dance that is involved in the worship of Vishnu. Then we have a couple of goddesses. We have Lakshmi, so you might know that. It's a popular name in India, Lakshmi, and she's a goddess of wealth. So wealth, prosperity, blessings, abundance. So she is celebrated during Diwali. She's celebrated as a goddess who can bring you good fortune in the coming year, celebrations, happiness, you know, kind of fortune and prosperity. That's so she's often shown holding gold coins. She's often depicted sometimes emerging out of a lotus flower. She has some very typical depictions. So, okay. Then the other two gods I want to talk about, one is Ganesha, and you might know that one because it's the elephant-headed god, right? That's very popular souvenir, very popular depiction. And he is the son of Shiva and one of his consorts, Parvati. So Parvati is also a very popular girl's name in India. One of the many consorts of the male gods have a lot of consorts who are also kind of goddess figures or semi-goddess figures. And Ganesha is known as the remover of obstacles and a god of beginnings and a god of travel. So if you're starting a new job or you're going on a journey, right, you might give offerings to Ganesha, as opposed to if you're wanting prosperity or you're playing the lottery, right? You might give some offerings and light some candles for Lakshmi, right? Whatever it is, you're going to pick the different god or goddess that you want. So he's most famous because of his animal head. And in a way, he's thought to be somebody who is intelligent, even though he has this kind of comical look. And people have interpreted his ears as that he's available to anybody, right? The large ears of the elephant, that's either he's going to listen to you. He will answer your prayers or listen to your, accept your offerings. Then the last one that I'm going to talk about, I've put a couple others on your list, but the last one that I want to talk about is Krishna. Now we've already mentioned Krishna because Krishna is a god who appears in the Bhagavad Gita, who has he takes on the form of a charioteer, is talking to Arjuna, the prince, about going to war and teaching him this philosophy of detachment. Do your dharma, do your duty, do your responsibility to the best of your ability, and then just let it go, right? You're not responsible for the results if you are truly doing the best that you can do. And he also introduces him to these various different forms of yoga, one which is known as bhakti. So bhakti is a form within one of the things I did is I listed some traditions that have emerged out of that have, particularly famous subsets of Hinduism, like Tantra, like Bhakti, Jainism, Sikhism, like different forms of that have come out and almost become their own thing, but they're all in a way part of Hinduism. And Bhakti yoga is intense devotion to the gods and goddesses. And it's expressed by love. Krishna is the god of compassion and divine joy and divine love and happiness. He's often depicted playing a flute. He himself often is playing in beautiful garden settings. He is known for seducing milkmaids because he's so young and charming. Right, so he's a very playful god. He's depicted being blue and with his flute, and has this kind of playful energy. And he's very much connected to bhakti yoga, which is sort of joyful devotion to the gods, joyful love, having joy and energy and positivity. So he is very popular. He's a very popular god. Think about Hare Krishna, right? So the Krishna movement. I grew up in California, all over the place. My world religions class went to the Krishna Center and they had great food. So we would go there back when I was in, now 40 years ago when I was in college. Unbelievable. So those are the those are the main gods: Shiva, Vishnu, Lakshmi, Krishna, Ganesha. Those are the main gods that are celebrated. But how are they celebrated? The vast majority of people in India are not engaging in high level philosophical reflection about Atman, Brahman. They're not doing that, right? That is part and parcel of the culture of India, but they are not reflecting on these texts or reading Sanskrit texts or engaging in that kind of thing. So what are typically everyday Indians doing? Well, typically a family or a region or a village will have, will celebrate a lot of the main holidays, but they'll also have particular gods or goddesses that they are devoted to. So you will often have in a Hindu's home a mini shrine to that particular god. And they might do offerings on that day or meditate or say prayers before that particular god, as well as participating in communal festivals. So what are the kinds of things that they engage in? The most common daily practice is called puja, which is basically offerings. So you can have communal pujas where you will go to temple and before an image of the god, you pile high fruits and candles and cakes and all kinds of offerings. We make offerings to God, right? The Greeks made offerings to God. And this is also this sense of commensality. We eat with the gods, we join with the gods. They've given to us all this abundance in our lives. We want to give back to them. So a daily ritual of puja, though, might simply just be the lighting of a candle and the saying of incense, something like that at a little shrine that you have. You might keep flowers on your shrine. So that would be a kind of daily activity, kind of like a daily morning prayer or something like that. You would light incense, freshen up the flowers, freshen up the fruit in front of them or in front of it or not. The other is there are prayers that people say, morning prayers, noontime prayers, prayers at dusk, prayers at night. So there's a daily ritual of prayers. And oftentimes these prayers, people might just recite famous parts of the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita. Recitation of sacred texts is a very big part, and memorizing sacred texts is a very big part of higher order spiritual practice in Hinduism. The other aspect, I think, of Hindu life that undergirds much of Hindu life is non-violence, which is called ahimsa. So the most famous way in which most Westerners know about non-violence is Gandhi, right? That Gandhi advocated for non-violence as a way to move through the world And if you experience violence, you know, you need to persist. Obviously, this had enormous influence on the civil rights movement, on people like Martin Luther King, learning about ahimsa, learning about methods of nonviolence. And so it's nonviolence that also is cultivating mindfulness, our concept about mindfulness, and also thinking about your karma, right? Every action, be mindful. What are you doing? What are you following your dharma? Are you performing service? Are you being self-sacrificing? Are you fulfilling your duties and your responsibilities? Are you being as nonviolent as possible? One form, if you think about bhakti religion within Hinduism, being one that emphasized joy and love and compassion. If you look at ahimsa, the kind of most extreme example of that is Jainism. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Jainism, but they're all vegetarians, and eventually they will sweep their path so that they don't step on any living beings, right? Complete and total nonviolence. And obviously, if you were at a high level of practice, you would eventually stop eating. Now, most Jains don't do that, but they try to be nonviolent in every form, and it's most popularly known through their diet, through their vegetarianism and veganism. But nonviolence and mindfulness, these characterize the daily lives of Hindus. And then just like every religion, there are festivals of celebration that have typically are conceptualized as acting out or reminding us about some key aspects of their mythologies, of their great epics, just like we do at Easter. You know, we're remembering a particular time. Passover, they're remembering a particular part of their narrative. So some that you might have heard of that we talked about is Diwali. That's the festival of lights. And it's just a general victory of light over darkness, of enlightenment over ignorance. How can we move towards light, towards compassion, towards knowledge, towards insight? So it's a kind of a spring cleaning, or for that, yeah, their weather is a little bit different. It happens in October, but they clean their homes just like people do for Passover, right? You want to get your homes very clean. You light lamps, you perform special pujas, little rituals and shrines. And it's manifested by exchanging sweets and gifts in a way like in Purim, when people go around and exchange sweets and gifts. The other one that you might have seen, or that oftentimes you'll see on television or just popularly on social media, is Holi, which is the festival of colors. And this is the celebration of spring, and it's a generally renewal, celebration of good over evil. And they throw those colored powders at each other. So they run around, and it's a celebration of light and brightness and colors and singing and dancing and feasting. Then you have other festivals. For example, there's a 9-day celebration called the Navaratri, is what it's called, and it's dedicated to the divine feminine. And it spends 3 days celebrating Durga, 3 days celebrating Lakshmi, and 3 days celebrating Saraswati. So celebrating each of these divine feminine. So they have, you know, annual festivals just like we do as well. And of course, just like you see in every tradition, they have lifetime rituals as well. So they have birth rituals, death rituals, marriage rituals, marriage rites. So you have all of those kinds of standard things. Mostly it will involve sweets, treats, feasting, singing, lights, just same kinds of things that we have as we come out of our season. Now I want to start by talking about a couple things. Number one, about yoga. Right, so yoga, the word yoga means it comes from the word yuj, which means to yoke or to unite. And basically yoga early on in the Vedas means spiritual practice through meditation, renunciation, and intellectual inquiry that is going to lead you to enlightenment. And it's all of these things that are yoked together. And so you see it in the early this references to yoga. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is a later part or later text that is part of the Mahabharata, that's where you get another development in saying, well, there's different kinds of yoga. You could have devotional yoga, bhakti. You could have knowledge yoga, which is called jnana. You could have karmic yoga, selfless service, right? There's all different ways that you can do that. What ends up happening is in the medieval period, it starts to be developed into a more regimented practice in which people are trying to align their bodies with their spiritual practice. And that's where you get more of what we might think of as, start to get what we might think of as yoga today. Hatha yoga, postural yoga, you know, this kind of warrior pose, all that kind of stuff. And this idea was that you needed to have a physical practice as well as an intellectual and a spiritual practice. But again, nobody in the West knows about yoga until you get to the 1893 Parliament of World Religions, when Swami Vivekananda introduced yoga to the world at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago. And so he focused on yoga and teaching yoga to the West. And you start having then, that's at the end of the 19th century, throughout the 20th century, you start having people coming and teaching different kinds of yoga. Now, one of the things that has happened is, I have towards the end some controversies, is the notion of yoga also incorporates the notion of the guru. And the guru is a spiritual teacher. And there is a lot of emphasis on learning from a spiritual teacher, you know, sitting at the foot of a spiritual teacher, listening to the wisdom of somebody who is much further along in the cycles of samsara than you are. Obviously, this is and has been ripe for exploitation. And there has been innumerable warpings of yogic practice and the role of the guru, from Osha and Wild Wild Country to, I mean, just go on cult documentaries, right? And so there's been lots and lots of exploitation when you put somebody up, and that's the end of that. On a high pillar, a high status like that. So that has been a serious issue. And that has also gone somewhat hand in hand. There you go. Here, just have to stand exactly. Now move around. That has gone hand in hand with the Western appropriation and commercialization of yoga. So not only do you have teachers from India who have come over here, you know, famously the Beatles got all into it, you know, all this sort of stuff. But also this becomes commercialized, right? The true relationship between, if your guru is asking you for money, they are not a guru by definition. So, but you see how this becomes completely exploitable. And the West, there's been a lot of issues with the Western co-optation, appropriation of yoga. Now, you know, you can go to the Parenton, you know, Senior Center and do yoga there. You can do it at the JCC. It's taught in high schools. And so there's been a lot of concern with it now has just become a form of exercise to keep limber and completely divorced from any spiritual practice. And people are making up certain kinds of yoga, hot yoga and speed yoga, you know, all these different kinds of things. And it's all totally divorced. And it's been commercialized, and you have gear and mats and all of this. And so this is largely viewed by scholars of religion and by, you know, as a deeply inappropriate co-optation of a spiritual practice. It would be like taking Christian ascetic practice and marketing it as a quick diet, you know, or something like that. So that's one of the controversies that related to the Western appropriation, the guru and yoga. The other thing that I wanted to talk about just briefly, I only have 4 minutes left, is Hindu nationalism, right? So the idea of Hinduism as a thing, right? I started out by saying it's not a thing. Then you did start to have, in response to imperialism, you did start to have Hindus claiming that for themselves, right? No, we're not going to absorb Christianity. We're not going to absorb Islam. We're our own people. So you started to have Indians themselves take this term, which is a fake term, right? But take this term and adopt it for their own to sort of protect their own practices. Well, in the late 20th and early 20th century, this really since Gandhi accelerating from the 1950s on, you have had right-wing political Indians wanting to take Hinduism and make a kind of Hindu nationalism, right? Just like Christian nationalism. People who want to have Christian nationalism and no other religions. In India, they want, India has a secular constitution. India has a secular government. Well, Hindu nationalists don't like that, just like Christian nationalists don't like that we have a secular government explicitly, right? So Hindu nationalists don't want that. They want there to be a kind of Hindu nationalism, a Hindu culture, and this is really a way to oppress the Muslim population, which has increasingly grown. So that's a lot of what's going on with Hindu nationalism. And so Hinduism has taken on, that term has taken on an unfortunate kind of cast because of its association with right-wing fascist nationalist politics in India with Modi and people like that. The last thing that I just want to mention, because this is something that people know a lot about, is the caste system. So recall to mind that I was talking about how Brahman, and there's a certain order to the universe. And Brahman is oftentimes conceptualized as having different parts, and that these different categories of Dharma realms relate to based on your birth, your occupation, and your societal roles, are symbolically, you have the Brahmins are the priestly class, that's the head. The Kshatriyas are the warrior class, the rulers. You have the Vaishyas, those are the merchants and the traders and the landowners. You have Shudras, which are laborers and service providers, and then you have the untouchables or the Dalits, right? This caste system. And basically, you can see how these ideas that you're cycling through life, ever moving up, right, closer and closer to enlightenment, how that took form eventually. It's not originally supposed to, but it took form as a way of instituting a class system, a caste system, a class system in India, which was used as a way to keep people down, to prevent mixing among classes. Even if you don't have legal enforcement of it, it has enormous sociocultural influence, this kind of class caste system. Even though it's supposed to be, yes, we're all moving through these cycles. Of course, in reality, it becomes a way to socioeconomically and culturally discriminate against people and treat other people, treat them not well. The caste system was illegalized in 1950. So it is illegal to have any laws that discriminate on the basis of caste. But just like the United States is ostensibly supposed to be in some ways a classless society, we know that there are classes. We know that in that class can be related to education, job, race, region of the country, area that you live, wealth, all kinds of things. And then that can be a powerful force, even though it's not an official thing that you put on your, on your taxes or something like that. So it's the same in India. So you had people like Gandhi speak out against the caste system. He specifically tried to rebrand the Dalits, the untouchables, as children of God, much in the same way that Jesus wanted to say, right? No, the divine cares the most about those who are at the bottom and have that kind of struggle. But of course, the caste system is still widely pervasive and affects people's lives, if not legally and technically, socioculturally and economically. So those are the greatest hits of Hinduism. And Hinduism, and in part because of resistance to things like the caste system, Buddhism does emerge out of Hinduism. So many of these ideas about going through cycles of life and achieving moksha, nirvana, it's these kinds of ideas. You start to see them develop in different ways, but Buddhism has its origins in Southeast Asia and among Hindu thinkers and eventually developed into its own set of traditions and variations. And that's what we'll talk about next week. Okay, right.
You know, him and who's all those people drowned in the river. Tell us about the ritual of going into the river and, you know, cleansing yourself.
Yes.
I mean,
So, yeah, so another big thing in Hinduism is pilgrimage, right? And there are certain pilgrim, and so, and the idea that the world is all a manifestation of Brahman, and so very powerful natural things, certain mountains, certain rivers, right? So the Ganges, things like that. So first of all, the Ganges is incredibly polluted because people will put cremated ashes in there, dead bodies in there, engage it, but it's also an incredibly sacred river. And there's pilgrimage routes, and pilgrimaging to very famous temples are a major aspect of it. So there's many different kinds of smaller rituals that are, and smaller kind of saints days in a way, but for smaller deities that are called tithis. So I'm not exactly sure what was the ritual that they are participating in, but problems specifically with the Ganges has long been an issue. And of course, environmentalists are like, can we clean up the Ganges? And yeah, because it's, I would not go in it.
Yeah.
So please critique and improve one of the key thoughts I'm taking away today. One of the first things you said, there is no such thing as Hinduism.
Yeah,
But yet you've talked about it for an hour.
yeah,
So what I'm interpreting you to mean is that unlike the monotheistic religions, there's no one God.
no,
There's no one text.
no one founder, no moment in time when it began, nothing like that.
So if
There's no central authority, there's no pope, there's no central authority, nothing like that.
So it's more amorphous.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's a vast collection, an array that, you know, probably the earliest things were the recitations of these hymns and poems that we find in the Vedas, and frankly, goddess worship. I mean, goddess worship, or sacrifices to goddesses as sources of fertility and rebirth and reflecting rebirth, etc. That's probably the earliest stages of Indian traditions on the Indian subcontinent. But then, you know, it's a billion people, right? So it's the vast majority of Hindus are, I mean, I think something like 0.04% of the United States is Hindu, but you know, 89% of India is Hindu. So it's just a vast array, and they have regional differences. But these are ideas that undergird all of them, all of these ideas, this notion of reincarnation, life being a cycle, that you're endlessly being reborn, you get another chance, reborn, right, to collect your karma, that you have a duty and that you need to perform your role and your duty. That's why, you know, we have this in America too, in different kinds of families, but the sort of intense devotion, for example, that many of my Indian students feel towards their families, right, and that deep responsibility, and right, that is part of your duty as a daughter, that's part of your duty as a parent, you know, all of these sacrifices for your children, therefore, you know, all of these kinds of notions, these undergird, and the same kinds of rituals of making food offerings, incense and flowers before shrines and lighting candles. You'll find that all over. You'll find that in southern Italy and southern India, northern India, you know, all over the place. You'll find it in Nepal, you'll find it in Bengal, in other places where you have big pockets of Hindus, but they might be worshiping a different god locally. They might have their local celebrations, but they all are essentially engaging in puja, these rituals of offerings to the gods, meditation, and hope for spiritual growth. But there's no central authority, there's no originary point, there's no one single text, there's no one ritual. It's like, oh, well, if you don't go through this, you can't be counted as a Hindu. No everyday Hindu is going around saying I'm a Hindu. They're not, you know, in India, I mean, they might now that they're exposed to Western culture and television, but you wouldn't have somebody in 1830 being like, I'm a Hindu. They'd be like, no, I live in this village, I'm at this caste, we worship this god, we do these festivals, you know, those kinds of things. We're praying for abundance, we're praying for, you know, blessings, bounty, goodwill, good fortune, knowledge, insight. You know, they would say they're working towards those things.
Question from Betty on the screen.
Yeah, if here in Rochester, I know there's a Hindu temple on Pinnacle Road. Are Hindus in America growing or decreasing in population, growing in population? And the second question is, can one be a Hindu and also a Christian or a Jew?
So I would say definitely you see the phenomenon much more of one being a Buddhist and being a Jew or a Christian. You see that much more. But I think Hindus would say, well, you do need to sort of believe in our specific gods. Like you need to believe in the power of Vishnu and Shiva and things like that. I don't know about whether or not the population is growing or increasing, but I think it's about 1.4 million Hindus live in the United States, which is not very many. That's the population of Estonia. So not very many, but I don't know if it's growing. I would say, you know, Muslims are growing in the United States, Christians are decreasing, Jews are decreasing. So to the extent at which I mean, who knows, maybe immigration, right? It might be going down again because of immigration issues, but I don't really know if it's growing. I don't happen to know that. Yes.
Can you ever go backwards, like you're trying to go,
Oh, sure.
so it's not like you automatically go.
No. That's why you get
You
bad
can drop
karma.
right down, right?
Yeah, that's your karma. Yep, so you can accumulate that, you know, if you're murdering and pillaging, you're gonna go get back down, you know, you're gonna go back down. Be as part of that cycle. Yeah, you're gonna get what you deserve, right? Yeah. So,
Right.
okay.
Thank you, Ann.
Great.
Gifts of food and flowers and things that are given on these altars.
Yeah,
Obviously to the gods, but.
Yeah.
What is done with them then? You know, is the food like given to the poor or?
yes, at a big temple situation it is. In your home, you would just be putting up small things and then you'd be throwing them out and refreshing them. Yeah, but certainly if you give major gifts of food, like a village puja or whatever, then that food is shared out.
Okay,
Yeah, because you're, this notion of divine commensality, eating with the gods, which we've now ritualized into Eucharist, right? So, but originally, we were having a meal,
Yeah.
right? What the Bible calls an agape feast in Second Peter, we were having a meal that we were sharing. And you were sharing food with Jesus, but we're also symbolically eating Jesus, right? But this notion of commensality with the gods is very widespread and common. And so it's that kind of notion. So we do also can eat that food as well. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Wow. See you next week for Buddhism.
Nice.